Welcome to the presentation today. My name is Douglas Gabriel. Today we're going to be talking about the mysteries of meteors, meteorites, and comets. Now, before I get started, I have to preface this entire presentation with somewhat of a scholastic apology. And the reason is because I'm going to be quoting from Rudolf Steiner, or making reference to him, and in the article which will appear with this below the video, you will see that there are many selections that I've taken from Rudolf Steiner's work so that we could illuminate his insight on the nature of meteorites and comets. And let me just say that when I came across these things many years ago, when I was much younger, it has taken decades for me to understand what it is that Rudolf Steiner was saying in his course called Rudolf Steiner on Astronomy, which was given to the Waldorf teachers in Germany, in Stuttgart, Germany, between January 1st and 18th in 1921. Now, this book has in it some of the most shocking realities of astrophysics that you can find in the modern age, because Rudolf Steiner illuminates things that had yet to be discovered. He clearly defined the galactic center, the supergalactic center, and the center of mass of our solar system, the motion, the true motion of the sun and the planets around the sun, and the nature of light. And I'm going to talk about some of those today. But to preface this, I just want to say the following. There's a book, one of my favorite, that I had come across before some of these things were actually discovered by science. And one of them is by Theodore Landscheid, this book right here, Sun, Earth, and Man, A Mesh of Cosmic Oscillations, How Planets Regulate Solar Eruptions, Geomagnetic Storms, Conditions of Life, and Economic Cycles. Yes, we have talked before about what the sun does in relationship to the earth, even creating flus, creating illness, creating earthquakes, all the dynamics on the earth, including the ocean currents, which then determine weather and climate, all come from the sun. But science does not truly understand what the sun is. And I personally, because of my relationship to this study, being a Waldorf teacher, a longtime Waldorf teacher, of course, I studied this book so that when I spoke to the children about such things, I could actually have some insight to it. Well, what I'm about to tell you today is also the cutting edge of astrophysics. And the problem with astrophysics today is they do not have a cosmology. And many of the things I'm going to tell you, you can look up to make sure that you fact check what it is I'm saying. But trust me, I have fact checked them ad infinitum. And what I find is that so far, everything that Rudolf Steiner revealed in his astronomy course to the Waldorf teachers has been proven. Some things have yet to be proven because they are so profound, but other things have been proven sometimes only within the last few years, the last 10 years, the last 20 years, which Steiner died in 1925. Therefore, one could actually say that Steiner's astronomy, his cosmology, are in fact revelations. Where he got this information, I cannot tell you. Certainly, if you look back into some of the mythologies of Babylon, of the Assyrians, Sumerians, the Chaldeans, he does make reference to some of these things in relationship to pointing out mythologies that also relate to these astrophysics and the facts of astrophysics. But in fact, I have to give a very wide view, a panoramic view of some things that you may find shocking. That's the reason the title of the selections that I've taken from Rudolf Steiner, with a little introduction from myself, is called The Mysteries of Meteorites and Comets. So it's hard to tell you where we should begin, because in fact, everything that you've probably been taught in science is only a piece to the puzzle. Let's just take a few things. Let's take the fact that in the astronomy course, he pointed out that the galactic center was at approximately, in a tropical astrological chart, approximately 27 degrees Sagittarius. He was the first one to point that out. Did science know or suspect or speculate that there was a galactic center? Yes, but they couldn't pinpoint it. He pinpointed it to the very degree. And then there's a supergalactic center. That is about, tropically speaking, astrologically, about 1 to 3 degrees Libra. So when we look out into our solar system and we look beyond, we get into some very, very sketchy speculation. And I'll come to that in a minute. But also something pointed out in Theodore Landscheid's book that I just held up. Great book, by the way. You definitely want to get a hold of this. It's cutting edge. And it's an older book, but it's still cutting edge. Is that the center of mass in our solar system is not on the sun. As a matter of fact, it's not on the sun at all. It's in a dynamic point between the sun and the 3 inner planets and the 3 outer planets. And in fact, Rudolf Steiner points out, which Theodor Landscheid does not point out, and I have to suspect that Theodor Landscheid, being German, certainly could have come across Rudolf Steiner's astronomy course, simply read it, looked into the sky, used modern equipment, and he was then accredited with finding the supergalactic galactic center and the center of mass not being on the sun. And that was a shock to scientists to say, what? Of course the center of mass has to be in the sun. But remember, these are the same scientists who believed that the sun used to rotate around the Earth, or that the Earth moves in an ellipse around the sun. In fact, it doesn't, or even a circle around the sun in a specific plane. It doesn't. You can now simply Google, I should have brought a picture of it, but now it's very clear. They took all of the different observations they make of the sun with the 5 different types of telescopes they have, and all the motion of the sun and the planets as seen from Earth perspective with mechanical devices. They combined them, and they then said, here's the model. And the model is a beautiful model because, of course, Rudolf Steiner pointed out the sun is in a dynamic galactic movement towards a star in Vegas, the constellation Vegas. But in fact, it is not moving in the way that scientists thought. Only recently, probably within the last 5 to 10 years, I can't remember exactly when this happened, but those modeling, computer modeling of the movement of the solar system showed that the sun is moving towards that point that I just mentioned, and the 3 inner planets are moving behind in a limnoscate, figure 8. So the sun is moving, the 3 inner planets are on 3 different planes, as it were, moving behind the sun, and then the 3 outer planets are in a large limnoscate, figure 8, moving behind the sun. And when you see this dynamic movement, you will notice that it looks like the structure of DNA. Of course, DNA generally is all clustered, but if you stretched it out and you had the sun at the top, it looks like DNA. Well, this was a shock, and the center of mass was not found on the sun, but it was found in a dynamic point in between the sun and the 3 inner planets, affected also by the 3 outer planets. And so everything that we have ever been taught in school about astrophysics has now basically been changed, because remember, scientific theories are nothing more than speculation, and they're actually guesswork, and they may be less accurate than even the mythologies of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. And today we'll talk about the sun being known as Marduk in the Babylonian mythology, also Assyrian and Sumerian, and specifically, Rudolf Steiner points out in the mystery centers of the Chaldean mysteries, Marduk and the mythology is something that we should pay attention to because it tells us many wonders that have yet to be discovered. So that is just one thing, 3 things that Rudolf Steiner said in the astronomy course: the galactic center, supergalactic center, center of mass. Also in there, he made many, many other statements which today are now being proven. For instance, just recently, as one of our oldest satellites tried to enter into interstellar space beyond our solar system, they found a superheated plasma bubble, 90,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And it seems as if nothing that we know of, that we create, will be able to get through that barrier. In other words, there's a bubble around the sun, but remember, it's not a round bubble. It's kind of like a long bubble with this sun moving and pulling the planets behind it. But Rudolf Steiner said that once we get to the edge of our solar system, anything beyond that, we can't even imagine. And if we try to use the logic of scientific studies on the Earth, we will simply fail in our mission to try to theorize or speculate about what is beyond our own solar system. Also, Steiner pointed out that from the sun emanates 4 substances: warmth, light, sound, and life. Sound and life are actually magnetism and gravity. But he also said that the sun's light goes out to the realm of Saturn, and then part of it turns around and invisibly comes back to the sun. And that's called now by scientists the solar winds, the solar breath. So once again, in his astronomy course, he predicted that nature of the sun and sunlight, and it has been proven to be true. Another thing he mentioned is that light, as we know it, can actually go much faster than what we believe is the speed of light. And he goes into great descriptions about looking at the frontal motion of the edge of light. And remember, all of Einsteinian theories are based upon the a priori assumption that there is a luminiferous ether. There's an ether in which light can be transmitted through. And this luminiferous ether is hardly ever addressed by scientists. But now, every theory of everything, what they call a TOE, T-O-E, a theory of everything, almost everyone that I know of refers to some type of ether or etherons or ether particles, and they all completely accept the idea that there's what we call light ether. Steiner called light ether, but we now call in science luminiferous ether. So these ethers from the sun, he described exactly how they work, and that the 2 of sound and life, which would also be considered to be magnetism, electromagnetism specifically, and gravity, really don't fully come into the Earth atmosphere. They surround the Earth, they create the magnetosphere of the Earth, but they do not, in fact, bring the true nature of sound, which is the harmony of the spheres, the sound that the sun creates, the sound that the planets create as they whir through space and send that vibration to the Earth. That's called the harmony of the spheres by Pythagoras and others. And of course, Rudolf Steiner refers to it as that. And so we are only beginning to understand that the sun has actually 7 ethers, but 4 ethers and then another ether that holds them together that we already have to imagine is there, which Steiner calls the Akashic ether. The Akasha had Erwin Laszlo, one of the great scientific thinkers of our time, who pulled together all the research on zero-point physics in his books, another person I follow very closely, points out that there has to be an Akashic ether that is the envelope, the vessel for the other 4 ethers, warmth, light, sound, and life, to work in. Well, Rudolf Steiner pointed out in the astronomy course that light would be able to go faster than what we know is the frontal motion of light. He said, matter of fact, once light reaches an endpoint, light in between that endpoint and its source, the sun, can move at almost infinite speeds. They now, in lasers, have made light go faster than what we know is the general speed of light. So once again, a revelation of Rudolf Steiner's. And another one which has only come to light in, I think, probably only the last 5 years have they gotten true statistics on a thing that points out that what Rudolf Steiner said, and I'll tell you what Steiner said, and then you'll see how difficult it is to sit around and wait for science to look in the right place. And generally, this discovery was found accidentally from people who were in space, would see these brilliant flashes of light, and they would happen periodically, and but not in the same exact spot. Sometimes they now know, Well, sometimes it would happen every 8 minutes, and they now know that is the cycle of this, called a magnetic flux transfer event, or a magnetic flux transfer event portal. Now, Rudolf Steiner says basically that in this motion of the sun and the planets, that the sun has a magnetic rope, what he calls a cable tow, that goes from the sun to each of the planets, and that pulls the planets behind the sun. Now, that sounds crazy. First time I read that, I thought, what does that mean? How can that be? How in the world does that manifest itself? Now, because of they actually launched 4 satellites into orbit to watch these points, which are generally on the side facing the sun, that this magnetic flux transfer event, these portals, they called them doorways to begin with, and they've changed the name. Like every year, they change the name of this phenomena, basically to point out that scientists didn't want to be caught with their pants down, not knowing something as important as how does the Earth move around the sun. But these points, when they open up, create a super magnetic connection between the sun and the Earth, which shouldn't actually be able to have magnetism, gravity, and light that the scientists are still working with. These outdated theories were actually true. This couldn't happen. There couldn't be a possibility that the sun could instantaneously connect with the Earth. It takes generally 8 minutes for the emanations of the sun to reach the Earth in the fastest motion of elements coming from the sun. In other elements, it takes days. So when they found this, they were completely shocked. Now they have a lot of statistics on it, and they're beginning to find out that what it is a cable tow. They call it a rope, a magnetic rope. And how is this magnetic rope created? By 4 magnetic substances that are gathered around a central core in this rope. So it's literally wound like a rope. And it also is wound just like the solar system and the sun is winding towards a point in a far distant point and pulling the planets behind it. So this is cutting edge science. And if you really want to have your mind blown, start reading the theories about what they now call magnetic flux events, and you will find that you won't read a paragraph before you say, wait a second, this then should throw out all previous theories. Yes, that's true. And other things Rudolf Steiner said. So he said that the rings of Saturn are the edge of our true solar system, and that the theories of gravity and that the concepts of gravity actually do not really apply. So they found that the G ring, the outer ring around Saturn, has woven particles, just like this rope that I just described, that the sun is pulling the planets behind it. So this outer ring of Saturn has interwoven strands. Well, they'd always said before that these rings of Saturn were cast out because of the rotation of Saturn, and that, of course, there couldn't be such a gravitational manifestation in the rings of Saturn that would cause this to happen. So as soon as the first satellites got good pictures of this, they literally said many years ago when this happened, we must throw out all of our theories of gravity. And as we know now, because of certain black holes that they've watched very closely, they now say that, yes, there is such a thing as gravity waves. So there really is a substance of gravity. It's not just the interaction of 2 bodies in space that have a dynamic reaction. It is, in fact, a force of nature, which is very little understood. And when you look at, though Steiner did not predict this, he predicted part of it, but when you look at the new discoveries of supergalactic black holes in the center of most galaxies, and the ion jets that come out of them, which again, they've changed the name of that ion jet 10 times in the last 10 years. I swear every time I look, they have a new name for it. But this ion jet actually produces more energy than the entire galaxy. And it comes directly out of the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy. Again, scientific theories that have to be thrown out because these things should not be possible according to the way science wants to describe things that are beyond our solar system. So Rudolf Steiner pointed out in the astronomy course, don't even try to use human thinking to understand what is beyond our solar system, because you cannot. And so that outer bubble around the Earth, around the solar system, 90,000 degrees Fahrenheit, unimaginable. That light can be accelerated faster than the speed of light, unimaginable, unscientific. That the sun is pulling the planets behind them, complete nonsense, the scientists would have told you just a few years ago. That the sun can connect to the Earth instantaneously through the 96 million miles between here and the sun, they would have said that's complete crazy talk. That is mythology. That is nonsense. Doesn't even rise to the level of a legend. It is complete, ancient, mythological misunderstanding. But that's not true. The Sumerians had an understanding of the motion of the stars that still baffles the scientists who study it. And we don't have many of the Sumerian and Akkadian records, and we haven't been able to translate even the ones that we have. So there are great pieces of wisdom in these ancient teachings. And Rudolf Steiner knew that. He integrated that. But remember, he was a clairvoyant. So he simply, when asked, would go out and look at these things and bring them back and give the answers, which may not be able to be understood for about 100 years. Steiner died in 1925. So 100 years later, in just a few years, we are going to realize that most of the things that he said were absolutely true. But people like Theodore Landscheik get the credit for it, or people like the scientists who believe they discovered this rope that connects the Earth to the sun. No, Rudolf Steiner had pointed that out in 1921. So that's a preface to what I'm about to talk about, because when it comes to meteorites and comets, we get into some areas that are, we would call it nebulous. And of course, I mean that as a double entendre. It has a double meaning. So let's talk about meteorites for a second. Rudolf Steiner basically said, and I put this in the first sentence of the article, get meteorites and work with them. So get meteorites. Here's a meteorite. This is an iron meteorite. There are chondrite meteorites, many different names for that, which are more earthly, which have a lot of carbon substance and literally what you'd call pieces of the crust of a planet in it. So you have this type of iron meteorite, and he wanted us to get iron meteorite for some reason and work with it. Well, now there's medicines that he created that use homeopathic meteorite. So you take a bit of homeopathic dust, you turn a meteorite into dust, you put it in water, you dilute it over and over and over and over and over again until you no longer can scientifically find any iron meteorite in that water. And then that can become a homeopathic remedy that strengthens your blood. Why? Because the iron in your blood is the key to respiration. In other words, oxidation, feeding the cells and then taking away the carbon dioxide, bringing oxygen, bringing away carbon dioxide. This process is transferred through iron. But this type of iron that comes from space is not the same type of iron on Earth. But imagine the ancients, when one of these would fall from the sky, first off, they'd look up and they'd see this trail of fire behind it. And as you all know from the different meteorites that have exploded in Russia, that they, before they even hit the Earth, they can explode and create what is basically equivalent to an atomic reaction, an atomic bomb. And that's a small meteorite. Generally, meteorites that fall to the Earth, some have been 50 tons. Some, at least they speculate, have literally, one in particular, hit the Yucatan Peninsula, created, of course, a great crater there, and caused the dinosaurs to go extinct. So there's a great fear involved with the idea of meteorites zooming at us from space that could hit the Earth and cause incredible devastation. So a meteorite can cause wonder and awe as you look at it in the sky, descending with this fiery tail. And when it hits the Earth, it was a gift to the ancients. As a matter of fact, this was one of the founders of the Iron Age. Iron has to be purified generally on Earth from other substances. It doesn't usually come in a form like this. But when these would hit the Earth, if they would find one, and there are thousands of them of all different sizes hitting the Earth every year, but when they would find one this size and they heated it, they could hammer it into the hardest substance that they had, especially because already in the meteorite generally is a nickel, cobalt, arsenic, and carbon, and many other substances. Many meteorites come with olivine in them. They come with diamonds, microdiamonds in them, carbon that has been heated so much by its traveling through space, or, as I'll tell you in a minute, when it was in fact part of a planet, that these substances are easy to hammer into almost what you'd call steel today, because when you take iron, pure iron, and you add carbon, you can create steel. Carbon steel. So this substance would bring fire, because when they land, there's probably going to be fire if there's anything that it landed on that was combustible. It also created a wonder that literally made the ancients believe that these were from the gods, from the heavens, and that they should be turned into substances that would become sacred. All throughout Indonesia, they take this type of iron, have since time immemorial, and hammer it into what is called a kris, a K-R-I-S or C-R-I-S, kris, and they go into trance as they hammer it into a knife. And the knife's usually, I should have brought one here and shown you, but it has this type of waveform because that replicates the tail of the meteorite as it fell to Earth. Looks like the tail. And so that's the reason they thought they were like dragons falling to Earth. But they believed that they were beings, heavenly beings sent to the Earth. So they would hammer them into these knives, put an ornamental handle on it, put it in a sacred sheath, and they worshiped them. Now, let's get into something that again sounds like mythology. In Indonesia, the shamans would go into trance, and as they would hammer and make these krises, as you know, you hammer iron or steel into the shape, and then you have to cool it again and again. You heat it up and you cool it, you heat it up, you cool it. The more you do that, the stronger it becomes. In between, after they would hammer it, to cool it down, they would literally put it in their mouth and cool it down with their lips. And it wouldn't burn their lips, but it would leave the lip imprints upon the kris. I've seen plenty of them that have that. I've also seen the movies where they go in and they show these temples where the kris is on the wall like a statue of a deity, and it's worshipped. And they take them out and they dress them, they clean them, they wash them, and they're so sacred that in some cases you can't enter into one of these temples to look at this meteorite knife. I have a few of these myself, and I can say last week we talked about crystals. Well, crystals have a tremendous amount of energy, and certain crystals emit piezoelectric energy, and that's all very well and good. But when it comes down to it, when I have handed a meteorite to people, and especially to children, because generally they don't know what it is, and they come in all sizes. So I hand a small one to a person and say, put this in your hand. Close your eyes. What's the first word that comes to your mind? Hot, burning, sky, fire, everything you can imagine that would be a perfect description of a meteorite. So meteorites are sacred. Rudolf Steiner literally said, get meteoric iron and work with it. And that doesn't mean just turn it into a medicament for homeopathic meteoric iron. It means to work with it as a substance as it is, and or mold it. He said, mold this iron into something. So I have all kinds of these things. Many of them, though they're not molded, this is an example of one. Let's see if I can get a good picture of this. If you see there's etching on it, no iron on Earth has that etching. Now, most people don't know what a meteorite is. So I have bought meteorites this big for $5. They thought it was iron slag from making iron. And it turned out to be worth, $5,000, $10,000. Well, this is a slice, and that etching is called Windman-Staten etching. There's different people claim that they found the etching and they named it after themselves, so it doesn't matter. But the etching on this demonstrates that it is, in fact, a meteorite from space. If you buy a Rolex watch and the face of the watch is a meteorite, for the meteorite alone, they charge $10,000 for that face. It used to be you could buy a meteorite for next to nothing, but now they are very expensive. And if they have been molded or hammered or cut or made into something, they can be very expensive. If you get a meteorite knife, it can cost you $10,000. But now there's also other substances in meteorites. This is a meteorite called a palisite. And if you can see right through it. There's a green crystal that's called olivine. And then the stuff on the outside, the shiny stuff, that's white gold, palladium, and iron, and it doesn't rust. Sometimes meteorites, even iron meteorites, don't rust. Others that are iron with other substances, a lot more nickel and cobalt, rust like crazy. They'll rust until they fall to pieces. But this used to be worth hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Now you can buy these, even like this one made into a pendant. I had someone take some that I had and cut this and then turn it into a pendant so I could wear it. But this is from the asteroid belt. We're going to talk about that in a second. But the substance is olivine and all of these higher metals. How is it that something from space, olivine is at the core of the Earth. It's one of the, right next to basalt, olivine would be one of the inner layers of the Earth, and we find it all over. And you go to Hawaii, and I've been on a green sand beach, which was all olivine. That was the crystal that was left over from the ocean beating on lava rock until the lava rock was gone, and what was left was olivine. So it's called the green sand beach. An amazing thing when you lie on that beach, you get a certain sense of the inner core of the Earth. But this is not from the inner core of the Earth. This is from the inner core of a planet. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, I want to clear something up here. In America, you'll be told that this is a meteorite. This is called Tektite. Notice the big indentation here. This is from things hitting it while it was in space. And so they thought, you can see it on both sides, there's all these, this one's been polished. You'll see all these pock marks on it. Or you'll see something like this, moldavite. And you'll see that it's really jagged and it looks as if something has, hit it and carved it into this. This is the way that it fell to Earth. And then this is another one called Libyan glass. All three of these last that I've shown you, Tektite, moldavite, and Libyan glass, they will call it a meteorite. No, it's not a meteorite. It is called impact glass. When the meteorite hits the Earth, particularly here in America, the substance that it hit was it was black. It could be titanium or other substances, and it blew that substance. And it was so hot that when it hit soft ground, sand generally, that is filled with all these other metals and minerals, it blows it up into space. And so this went up into space. It stayed up there a while. It got hit by all kinds of cosmic bombardment, and then it fell back down to the Earth. Strangely enough, it falls back pretty much to the place that it was blown out of. So in America, you have black tektite. In Moldavia, you have this moldavite, which serpentine and other kinds of substances are in it that make it green. And this one was pretty much clear sand because it was landed in the Sahara Desert. You can go pick this stuff up by the bushel basket if you want. It used to cost thousands of dollars for a piece like this. Now that they know where it is and where it came from, and they don't believe it's a meteorite that fell to the Earth sporadically, they know exactly where to go and pick it up. For instance, iron meteorites, if you go to Baffin Island in Canada, you can walk around and pick this up until you have so much that your helicopter or whatever you came in won't be able to get off the ground. That's where they do most of the experiments for their moon rovers and for all kinds of NASA projects. And they pick this up, and they pick up so much of it that they could flood the market with it and make all the prices of meteorite go down. So they actually control how much is allowed to be picked up off of Baffin Island. So notice that the iron meteorites tend to hit in the high latitudes of the Earth towards the North Pole. Baffin Island is very far north. So it seems as if the North Pole draws in a lot of the iron meteorites. But the meteorites that come from other planets, because there are meteorites from the moon, pieces of the moon, pieces of Mars, pieces of Mercury, and others that are yet to be discovered where they're from. If you go to the Antarctic, there are shelves of ice, one going over the other, and when they recede, they've dug down and they find in the groove massive amounts of meteorites. And so they do the studies on these meteorites. And what do they find? They find that they have all kinds of substances in them. Carbon, as I pointed out, microdiamonds. They have yeast, which is, some people consider then that the meteorites that fell to the Earth with yeast on them were what actually inoculated the Earth so that life could begin here. That's a bit of speculation. There's, many other speculatory theories about how the Earth came to have humans living here and how the original DNA got here. There's a substance called galactose, and comets bring galactose because comets somehow, well, we'll discuss that in a minute, but they come out of the Oort cloud, or the Oort realm, and they sometimes bring galactose with it. And galactose is the closest substance to mother's milk. So when the ancients would look out and they saw the stars and they said it was the Milky Way and that the mother gives us our milk and she's the source of our birth, they were making reference to galactose. And now we know that in the spiral nebula of our galaxy, that we, about the time that DNA did start to grow in the ocean, on the Earth, we passed through a cloud of galactose, which was being held in stasis by ethanol. So some scientists speculate that's where humans came from. That's still a guess. That's not, we don't believe that's true if you're an anthroposophist and you study Rudolf Steiner, but it's interesting speculative theories. So when they find these Antarctic meteorites, that is where they usually find the ones that have come from the moon and from other planets, and they come in through the South Pole. So the iron ones tend to come from the north, and the chrondites and the pieces of other planets tend to come from the Antarctic. In general, meteorites, particularly iron meteorites, pallasites, like the one I showed you with the olivine in it, and, well, actually all kinds of them come from the asteroid belt. And what is the asteroid belt? Science can't tell you. Why is it there? What was it? It was a planet, according to Rudolf Steiner and according to the ancients. But specifically, Steiner tells us these things in great detail. So when you look at the asteroid belt, they will tell you, the scientists, that every once in a while, the gravity of Jupiter pulls asteroids out of the asteroid belt, and some of them come towards the Earth. There are literally millions of these floating, cruising by the Earth at tremendous speeds that they call near-Earth objects and near-Earth events. They have scientists who do nothing but keep track of the, supposedly right now, about 30,000 of them to make sure that they're not coming at the Earth to bring us a cataclysmic explosion that makes humans go extinct like the dinosaurs went extinct. Now, here again, we're going to get into something very crazy, but you will find that eventually scientists will prove that this is true. The sun not only swallows and eats comets, which we know quite well because some of the comets don't make it around the sun and come out. They go into the sun, they're swallowed by the sun. But when there are sunspots on the sun, the iron that is captured, meteorites that also go into the sun and are taken in to the core of the sun, and also iron that is already in the sun. As we know, scientists tell us that all the mineral substances on the earth come from stars. So stars are engines that create minerals and metals, particularly metals, and other substances. And then that is how we supposedly get all the substance that we use to make ourselves. Well, out of the sun and the sunspot come meteorites, iron meteorites in particular. And you will notice that in the last 10 years, we've had 3 or 4 meteorites that came, that the scientists keeping track of all of these things say, we didn't see it coming. It was obscured by the light of the sun. Well, of course, that's complete nonsense. It came out of the sun. And these are the ones that come very close to the earth. They come within the realm of between the moon and the earth. They come shooting in, and they come closest to the earth of any of these near-earth objects, these iron meteorites. Steiner points out that that is the sun spewing these out. That's something that you may have to wait for scientists to discover and to confirm. But if they track back the path of these meteorites, it goes directly to the sun. And they don't understand how this can be. So let's talk about where the meteorites came from. Rudolf Steiner says that our cosmos is not the Kant-Laplace spinning nebula that then starts to warm up, and then concretions or solid substance starts to form, and then it forms into a sphere, and then it in fact starts to rotate, and that's where the planets come from. Well, Rudolf Steiner says that's not true. He says that the light going out of the sun and that invisible light coming back, when they meet, they create spheres. They pull together the substances that create the spheres that are our planets. And that inside, it is not a hot molten core. It is in fact hollow. He also says that inside of the sun, it is not a superheated core. They know this now because the satellites, the SOHO satellites observing the sun, have looked into sunspots, and what do they see? There's nothing there. And they don't see hot substance. The 10,000 degree Fahrenheit solar flares and 10,000 degree, sometimes solar flares are more than that, but usually the surface of the sun is about 10,000 degrees. Interesting enough that over a sunspot, it's not hot at all. So the sun, according to Rudolf Steiner, is what's called a white hole, not a black hole sucking everything in. It is a white hole emanating things out. Even though substances like comets and meteorites do fall into the sun, they get digested, and he literally says the sun eats comets. And then they spew them out. Now, someone might say, wait a second, why would the sun spew these out at the earth? Well, why does a coronal mass ejection from the sun, if it hit the earth, it could fry the facing side of the earth completely. And this has happened a few times in history where there must have been something like a coronal mass ejection or something from the sun that literally burnt up civilizations, literally burnt rock, and they still stand there today as a mystery for science. So there's many emanations from the sun that we don't understand. Scientists don't understand at this point. And even the people who study Rudolf Steiner don't understand, what is a white hole? What does that mean? But a white hole is very much similar to what are called ion jets that come out of supermassive black holes in the center of galaxies. Our own galaxy has a supermassive black hole. We don't understand it. It does not have an ion jet yet because it seems that there's this polarity that happens, this breathing process between the supermassive black hole sucking in and taking substance to places we don't understand. And then the ion jet starts to come out as a cone in both directions, and it literally spins out stars. So when we talk about the creation of the universe, it's a lot of nonsense. It's a new mythology that we call science. As a matter of fact, Rudolf Steiner pointed out that once we fully understand the universe, we would find that it is the shape of a dodecahedron. Again, through computer modeling, taking all 5 forms of observation of the universe that we have, they put them into a computer, and the computer modeled the universe in the shape of a dodecahedron. Strange thing is, that if you go from the core of the dodecahedron out to its 12 pentagonal surfaces that are on it, make it kind of look somewhat like a soccer ball. At that surface edge, whatever was going out then automatically disappears and reappears in the middle, and then starts that process again. Now, that is something that he gives as a meditation for us. But he clearly points out that the universe is in the shape of a dodecahedron, and that is one of the most accepted theories right now of the outer shape of the universe. But that substance that goes out to the edge and then disappears and then reappears in the middle, oh, that sounds like crazy talk too. But what do they say a comet is? A comet comes from the Oort cloud, and it is no substance at all. And then it appears, and it has generally an icy core around iron and other substances, and in its tail has cyanide. In the astronomy course, Rudolf Steiner pointed out that the tails of comets have cyanide in them because they are a representation of the previous, he calls it, incarnation of the Earth. In other words, these stages I'm going to describe are stages where things weren't physical material, but then at the end of the stage, they left remnants of that. We still have that as comets. So comets come into what you would call incarnation, and they go towards the sun with their tail always going in the direction of the solar breath, which Rudolf Steiner said existed long before others did. They go around the sun in their perihelion, and then they go back to the Oort cloud in many cases, and then they disappear. They discorporate. They discarnate. So there is substance in comets that literally come from non-substance into substance, go around the sun, and then go back to the Oort cloud at this edge of the solar bubble, solar sphere they call it, go into interstellar space. And what happens there? They simply disappear. They no longer have physical substance. This sounds crazy, but this is the process that happens in the fake theories of the Laplace nebula theory, where things are spin and then they become concrete, they become planets. No, they actually breathe, just like this breathing in the dodecahedron. So in the first aspect of the Earth, when it was creating the first warmth substance, so the warmth ether, it was as big as the entire sphere that Saturn makes, if you imagine it as a sphere. Let's imagine it as a minute as a sphere or an onion with layers. So if you have this layer of the outside of Saturn, it created warmth. And then at the end of that, it discorporated. But when it reincorporated, when it came back into physical substance, it created Saturn, the planet Saturn. Well, the Earth has gone through 4 of these stages. The first left Saturn. The second left Jupiter. Then there's the asteroid belt. We'll talk about that next. The third left Mars. And the fourth created the Earth. So it's a breathing process in relationship to the sun. As a matter of fact, we were united with the substance of the sun, not the sun as it is now, but the warmth substance of the sun was actually created back in that first incarnation of the Earth called Saturn. Well, there was a war in heaven. You've all heard of the war in heaven, where the Archangel Michael, who holds this fiery, according to Rudolf Steiner, meteoric sword or spear given to him by the highest Father God or the highest divinity, and he used it to cast down substance from the higher realms of the divine, from heaven, down into the lower realms to manifest. Well, the asteroid belt, according to Rudolf Steiner, was a planet at one point. It was all together. And this is demonstrated by the olivine that's in meteorites, by the chrondites that have literally terrestrial Earth-like substance, and have all the metals and minerals, a lot of them on Earth in a different form. But because between the second and the third incarnation of the Earth, this planet became too solid, too fast, too material, too fast, there was a war in heaven. And in Sumerian, they call it Marduk. And Marduk takes a spear and stabs it into the head of Tiamat, the evil deity, and her head explodes. And then Marduk, the spirit of the sun, who is also another name for what we call the Archangel Michael, and Tiamat is another name for what we would call the dragon. Michael conquers the dragon, and the planet Marduk explodes, goes into pieces, many, 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 many pieces that create the asteroid belt that has millions of fragments in it. That was because the Earth wasn't ready to be that solid that fast. And because, as they call him, the dragon, the old dragon, or Lucifer, tried to get that shining warmth and light, because warmth was in Saturn, Jupiter was light, Mars is sound, and the Earth is life. Those are the four ethers that are created in what is called a heterochronic fashion. In other words, they built one upon another at a different time, but in between they go through this process like a chrysalis, where they go into amorphous substance and then come in again. And when they do, they remember and recreate the substances in the order that they were created through this cosmic process, this what Steiner would give us his cosmology. So the asteroid belt is in fact a planet that has exploded, called Marduk. So when we are getting pieces of Marduk, there's a reason for that. The meteoric iron that comes in either through the tail of comets, because the Perseids, the Leonids, and all of these meteor showers actually are the tails of comets that are coming, that we are passing through that tail once again, and then we see them at certain times of the year. That meteoric iron is the iron that we need to combat the sulfurous activity of what you would call the lower part of your body, or the lower chakras. And the meteoric iron is the iron in our blood that keeps that phosphoric process in check. Otherwise, the combustion process that iron mediates in the blood, if it gets out of control, then you go into a fever. The iron is the balance. That's the reason that Michael, the archangel, is seen usually with a balance, a scale balance and a sword, because he's keeping that balance in check. In the earth, it comes into the earth atmosphere and it enters into the water, enters into the earth, and it comes up through the plants. So we're eating meteoric iron. We're drinking meteoric iron all the time in very, very minute, almost homeopathic amounts. So when we talk about the Archangel Michael in the fall as beating back the dragon, the phosphorus, sulfuric activity of the heated summertime, and we're going into the cold winter, it is the meteoric iron in our atmosphere, as well as the iron that we take on September 21st, is in fact the festival of Michaelmas, the festival of the Archangel Michael, doing the dragon. We don't kill the dragon, we tame the dragon. And so you hold the dragon at bay, in abeyance. You still need that phosphorus, that sulfur, that hydrogen in this particular case also. We need that fiery nature in ourselves, but we can't let it get out of balance. And so when we're talking about meteorites, we can actually say that inside of our blood, the iron is like millions of little tiny meteorites that are helping the red blood cells hold oxygen, take it to all of our cells and nourish us, gather up the poisonous carbon dioxide and expel it from our bodies. In other words, taming that dragon between the different realms of cold and hot. Well, comets do the same thing. Rudolf Steiner says the comets come into our solar system to clean it of poisonous elements that would otherwise harm human beings if they got into the Earth atmosphere. So comets are like cleaners. They come in, they clean out this atmosphere, and they're a superstructure. They don't follow the normal rotation of the planets. They come from this realm. They each have their own particular path, their own periodicity. Sometimes they fall into the sun. Sometimes they break into pieces and fall into the sun. Or you've seen them when they've fallen into Jupiter and broken into pieces, or other planets. So they're attracted by certain planets, but particularly by the sun. And their tail always points away from the sun. Even when they go into the perihelion, they go around the sun. They come so near that any iron would have melted. So meteoric iron, because of these crystalline structures that we pointed out earlier, it's a special type of iron. It's an iron that is almost harder than any iron on Earth, and it's has substances in it that make it over material, make it somewhat of a super metal. And so therefore, meteors and comets have certain similarities. But meteorites we find in our blood. Comets, the only analogy, and Rudolf Steiner said in the astronomy course, everything in the cosmos can be found in the human body except for comets. But then he makes an exception. He says that when a woman is pregnant, the processes of a woman and her from menses, from her first menses, and the ability to have children through this special blood process mimics a comet. In other words, the baby comes out of nowhere and incarnates into a physical nature. Same thing that a comet does. So as a child is being born or is in utero, that is like a comet coming into this realm and manifesting. So the mysteries of meteorites and the mysteries of comets have not ended. In the mysteries of Steiner's astrophysics and his cosmology, we've only began to understand. And if one were smart and you wanted to be a famous scientist, all you would have to do is go to Rudolf Steiner's astronomy course, find things that he has said, prove them to be true, and then you could be as famous as Theodore Landscheid, who is considered to be one of the great astrophysicists of the last 200 years. So we must take seriously what Rudolf Steiner says. We must understand that in the fall, as we approach the winter, it is much to our advantage to take the imagination of the Archangel Michael holding the dragon at bay, because that is us. Our head, he says, is the perfect image of the cosmos, the round cosmos, really a dodecahedron. But this, as we look out, the spheres that we see in the cosmos, as well as what is inscribed in the motion of the planets around the sun and its shape and the planets and their shape, is mimicked in the head. And that is where the Archangel Michael exists. And he works through the heart to keep the dragon at bay. And so out of the heart, which is the center of the sun in the human body, and the organs around it inside of the rib cage, the 6 planets around the 6 organs, the 6 planets around the sun, the heart, is in fact a replication of our solar system. The head is like the cosmos, whereas the heart is like the sun, and below it is a dragon. So if we take seriously and take to heart what Rudolf Steiner has said about these cosmic forces, we can also find them in ourselves and use them to create health instead of illness.